Shalom, I'm Rabbi Michael Panitz. I'm the Rabbi of Temple Israel of Norfolk, Virginia, speaking to you from the pulpit of our synagogue. My message at this time is New York, New York, not my hometown anymore. When does home no longer feel like home? The answer from my grandparents came in 1969. They had lived for 30 years in a comfortable apartment in the Bronx on Grant Avenue between 167th and 168th Streets. In my earliest memories, the decade prior to 1969, it was a Jewish neighborhood with kosher bakeries and butchers, with a newsstand that had Der Tag and Der Vorwärts, as well as the English language newspapers, and of course, my favorite, the Batman and Superman comics. They cost 12 cents per issue back then. My middle brother and I would spend every other weekend there, my oldest brother enjoying solo time with his grandparents on his weekend. I was young enough to sit upstairs in the women's section of the Orthodox Nusach Ari synagogue on the Grand Concourse on Saturday mornings. On Sundays, my grandfather and I would ride the subways to Coney Island, or take in the history at the Museum of the City of New York, or most often visit my favorite dinosaurs at the Museum of Natural History. I think I had as close to an I-thou relationship with the Brontosaurus as a 6-year-old could have. Their apartment was in a handsome brownstone, 6 stories high. They were on the top floor, which meant we crossed an elegant tiled front lobby and then took an elevator. It was so unlike the home in which I grew up, with its staircases from the basement to the main floor and from the main floor to the upstairs bedrooms. Here, in this apartment building, we had a stately ride that we began by closing the iron gate, after which the door shut and we ascended. It felt magical to me. Once in the apartment, my grandmother started the weekend with a snack. Then my brother and I vied for the honor of taking the trash to the chute down the corridor. There was nothing like that in our home in Paterson, New Jersey. We would listen for the thud of the trash hitting the receptacle 6 stories below. That detail still shows up in dreams 6 decades later. We would also go down the hallway to pay the obligatory courtesy visit to our grandmother's sister, Mary. The sisters spent their entire lives down the corridor from each other. And in earlier years, their widowed mother, Hannah Halkin, was in the same brownstone. They had lived there ever since moving together from the Crotona Park section of the Bronx back in 1939. My grandfather owned a dental laboratory a few blocks away on the Grand Concourse. On Fridays, when we were with our grandmother, amusing ourselves while she finished getting ready for Shabbat, she didn't let us help much except for stirring the cookie dough and then licking the bowl. We would wait for the sound of the apartment door opening up. Papa would come in, hang up his coat in the front closet, and then our pre-Shabbat ritual would begin in earnest. Papa would empty the loose change from his pockets, which we would put into the blue and white JNF charity pushka, hanging from a hook on the wall of the breakfast nook. We ate there when it was just the 4 of us. Larger gatherings would be accommodated in the living dining room. Grandma would light the Shabbat candles, covering her eyes until she had finished reciting the blessing. Kisses all around. And then Papa would make Kiddush. This was the pre-grape juice era, and I had a thimble-sized silver mini goblet of the wine, which tasted like cough syrup. The challah, the roast chicken, and the tzimmus side dish are my equivalent of Marcel Proust's cup of tea as a powerful pointer in search of lost time. That sense of the neighborhood as an extended home, and of home as an extraordinary haven, endured despite the gradual decline of the safety and graciousness of the environment during the decade and a half of white flight starting in the mid-1950s. But when it ended suddenly and decisively. My grandfather had come home and was riding up the elevator. The one other passenger, like a character out of Saul Bellows' gritty New York-based novel, Mr. Samler's Planet, turned on him and pulled a knife, threatening his life if he did not surrender his wallet. Papa produced the wallet and said, "You can have all the money, but if you take my family photos, you may as well kill me." The mugger was not a murderer, not that day anyway, and he contented himself with the money. Within months, my grandparents had moved to Co-op City at the far edge of the Bronx. They had 20 more years there until ill health compelled their final moves. I'm thinking these thoughts now because I fear that New York, in general, may experience what my grandparents experienced in microcosm. The night of the election victory of Zohran Mamdani, the mayor-elect of New York, was marred by an anti-Semitic act, the painting of a swastika on a Brooklyn Jewish parochial school. As of this writing, one day later, the mayor-elect has not commented. If his comments will be in line with his previous assertions, he will condemn all forms of bigotry and then pivot to the special need to combat Islamophobia. I would love to be wrong in making this prediction. But even if the new mayor manages a new line, it will not erase his long record of anti-Semitic and anti-Israel rhetoric and his open sympathy for jihadist organizations. I feel as if the entire Jewish population of the city just had its version of my grandfather being mugged in the elevator of his own apartment house. For my grandparents, flight was the life-saving answer. But for an entire Jewish community, we need to do more. The Anti-Defamation League has set up a Mamdani monitor and created a New York City anti-Semitic tip line to facilitate scrutiny and response of growing anti-Semitism in one of the greatest Jewish cities in world history. This is not a call to partisanship. There is anti-Semitism on the far right from the likes of Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes, and I applaud that voices from the conservative side of the spectrum, such as Ted Cruz, are calling them out. Now, I would be cheered to see voices from the progressive side of the spectrum support the Jewish people at a time of growing need by calling out the increasing and hateful anti-Semitism within the ranks of the left. I worked in New York in 1991 when the administration of then Mayor Dinkins was inexcusably slow to counter the Crown Heights riots, a tsunami of anti-Jewish violence in Brooklyn after a tragic accidental death of a young Afro-Caribbean American unintentionally hit by a car driven by a Jewish driver in a Hasidic motorcade procession. I pray that New York will not have forgotten the lessons of those dark days. As is the case so often, the portion of the Bible that we happen to read in synagogue this coming Shabbat is uncannily on target. When Abraham and Sarah sojourn in Gerar, they prevaricate. They let it be known that they are brother and sister, which is loosely correct, using the term sister in a sense familiar in the Bronze Age family structure of that era. But they conceal that they are in fact husband and wife. When Avimelech, the local king, whom the Bible portrays as a decent man, is warned by God in a dream not to violate the honor of Sarah, he asks Abraham to explain his prevarication. Abraham responds in part, "I said to myself, there is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife." Genesis chapter 20, verse 11. This is a complicated story and has evoked different reactions from the classical Jewish commentators. But the point I would ask you to keep in mind is Abraham's awareness of the existential danger of living in a society where the life of anyone deemed other is dismissed as worthless. We Jews have lived in that situation over and over again. God forbid that it should happen in New York, a city as important in Jewish history as were in their day Constantinople, Cairo, and Cordoba, Sura, Pumbedita, and Baghdad. Tzur Yisrael, Kuma be'ezrat Yisrael. O Rock of Israel, arise in defense of your people Israel. Amen.